Ladies and gentlemen, in this RedGamingTech.com video, we're going to be continuing our look at X86 versus the rest of the world. In other words, why did the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One end up using an X86-64 architecture? Last video, of course, we looked at PowerPC, the Cell, and even ARM, and we went through the reasons why they're not exactly ideal candidates for the next generation consoles. And now, of course, we're left with, well, just one choice. So, the end of the X86 is always the 64. That, of course, means that it can address more than 4 gigs of RAM. Now, on a PC, this could be anything. I mean, obviously, you could even technically get over, 128 gigabytes of data if you really wanted to, and your operating system, motherboard, and everything supported it. Even for local desktop use, you could, for example, get 16 gigs, 32 gigs, whatever, and you can get large enough DIMMs. However, there are a number of other benefits for 64-bit extensions as well. These include better, for example, registers on the CPU. There are a number of other benefits too, but I'll let you Google those in your own time because they kind of fall out the scope of this video. So, we are now left with a X86 architecture. I'm just going to call it that for the remainder of this video because it makes life a little bit simpler. And one immediately wonders what type of CPU X86 is, and of course it would be the complex instruction set. Now, a Cisc processor, as we discussed earlier, is extremely important for the next generation because it basically means you can minimize the amount of coding. There was an interview actually done with the developers of Resogun. I actually put that interview up yesterday, so you can actually check that out. It's a really good interview if you're interested in PlayStation 4 performance and so on. And it was basically going into the specifications of the PlayStation 3 and PlayStation 4. And as it turns out, a lot of the tasks that you could designate to the PS4's GPU this time around could be done on the PS3's CPU. Specifically the SPEs, or synergistic processing elements inside the device, inside the cell. And it just turns out that you had to actually do a lot of bare to metal kind of coding, basically very low level coding for that, and it was a pain in the ass compared to what we're seeing now. And one of the reasons behind that was because it was a RISC type of device. In other words, a lot of the coding wasn't there to begin with, and Sony didn't give a lot of the libraries, especially early on, and so it was a bit of a pain. However, you could, because of the vector SMID nature of the CPU, you could actually do quite a lot with it. Regardless, now of course we are on an x86 path, so what other benefits does that give us? I'm going to read you guys out a quote from our good buddy, Mark Cerny. He said, and I quote, because of its very long history, the x86 is rather complex. You can run code today that was written for the original chip in 1978, and they just keep adding things for over 30 years. If you read an x86 manual, it takes pages to explain the different ways that you can move data from register to another, based on all the additional additions to the architecture over the years. It's a bit overwhelming from the perspective, but it gets very technical. It's a Cisc architecture rather than a RISC, and there is definitely first-party voices that said x86 probably couldn't be used in games, end quote. So this is what exactly I was saying. Cisc, for example, has a lot more, Cisc has a lot more instructions built in to allow the processing and the moving of data. We've seen a lot of those added over the years. For example, the MMX instruction set with the earlier Pentiums. We've seen, of course, the 3D Now extensions back in the day with Athlons, and it's continued to improve, and we're starting to see numerous other extensions that just keep adding and adding and adding. And that's all good because obviously you get much better performance, applications run a lot better. I mean, I remember the very early Intel ads, I think it was for the Pentium 3 actually, way back in the day, and I remember continuously seeing them in PC magazines and Even on television actually. And there would be Pentium Pentium 3? I think I'm sure it's Pentium 3. But anyway, it would say something like, accelerate your web experience, because it would have, instructions that were much better suited for web browsing and whatever else. And it was kind of one of those things where you could see the progressively improving the architecture, which is great from some perspectives. And now, most video games, I'm not saying all video games, because that would be a gross simplification, especially when you start taking into account, say, web browsing games, which are usually written in, say, some form of HTML or Flash. A lot of games now are starting to use like HTML5, for example. But a lot of games, nevertheless, the ones on, say, the PlayStation 3 or the average one on, say, the PC, is most likely written in some version of C. Now, some games, especially the Microsoft games, are sometimes written in like Visual C# or some version of it, for example, the Visual Studios type of situations, but a lot of games, especially cross-platform development, is written in C++. And it just turns out that if you actually look at the C code, it's pretty damn old. So if you were, and this is my favourite analogy in the world, but if you were to literally just go up to a game's developer back in the 80s, the early 80s, and you were to kidnap him, put him in like, a time machine, put him in your DeLorean, bring him into like, now, sit him down in front of the computer, whip him a few times, and until he starts writing code, that code would work. Now there's a couple of caveats, of course. Obviously, the code would be very messy. It probably wouldn't be ideal. He'd probably have to still get used to the coding environments of today. Blah, blah, blah. But the bottom line is, he would have a very, very good understanding of coding fundamentals. And this is why, of course, they say once a programmer, always a programmer. He wouldn't have to worry about learning new libraries. Now, obviously, C++ or the C language, for example, has improved over the years. There are new standards, there are new libraries that are being added all the time, and that's never going to change, right? So, there's always new standards, but the key is that the actual hardware, the fundamentals are always in place. Now, that's very important from the perspective of a programmer. However, it can also be a bit frustrating because a lot of the die, a lot of the CPU space, if you will. Think of the die whenever I say that. Just think of it like, draw a square in your mind and then just start partitioning space for different things. You don't have to partition them in any particular way, but just imagine, a certain section of that. This is not accurate, by the way, but let's just, for the sake of ease and clarity, let's just assume that you have a block that's like, 25%. Let's call it instructions for Cisc. It might be like 10% or something for a RISC. And in other words, you can see that the size is a lot smaller. Therefore, you can, as we said in the earlier videos, you can start to use that space for other things, for example, additional registers or whatever you need to do. Of course, the cell processor put in a lot of the SPEs and stuff, so it really started to balloon that out, and we know that each of those SPEs had their own cache as well. I believe the number was 256 KB for each of the SPEs, which is pretty large when you're dealing with that amount of SPEs. I can never remember if the PS3 had 7 or 8. I know that, I'm pretty sure they had one disabled or one reserved for system, but whatever, it doesn't really matter for the purposes of this video. Regardless, now, the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One are not the first kids on the block with this. The early Xbox, the original Xbox made by Microsoft, was very similar actually in X86 design. It used this kind of like a bastardized Celeron Pentium 3 hybrid. I believe it was running at 733 megahertz, and I believe it was based on the Coppermine process, which was kind of like, brand of the CPU, and it had a few changes to it, and that was combined with a GeForce graphics card, of course, from NVIDIA, and 64 megabytes of RAM. So it was a very powerful system, and it actually made porting games like Halo, for example, relatively painless between the Xbox One, the original Xbox, and the PC. And in some ways, it makes a lot more sense. Actually, the original Xbox and the Xbox One are almost brothers in that respect, because Of course, it was also using a version of DirectX, a very early version. I don't remember which version it was now. I think it was 6 or 7. And there were a lot of other similarities between the two platforms, and ironically enough, it would be a hell of a lot easier to emulate Xbox, the original Xbox, on the Xbox One, simply because of very similar architectures. So why didn't Microsoft carry that on? Why did Microsoft say, you know what, guys, we're going to just abandon all hope of ye who enters here, and why did they just decide instead to go with a PowerPC architecture? A little bit of trivia for you: the PowerPC architecture inside the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 are actually very similar. The cell processor contains a PPE and an SPE. Well, actually, it contains several SPEs, if you want me to be technical, but the PPE, which is the power processing element, I believe is the name. Actually, not processing, processor element. And it was based on a power architecture, so it could run PowerPC and power code. But that power code, if you actually notice, if you take a look at the specifications without knowing anything, if you just look at the raw performance specifications of the Xbox 360 CPU and PS3 CPU, one may wonder, well, they're both running at 3.2 GHz, and you'll both notice that the power PC architecture in the Xbox 360 is a tri-core which runs 6 threads, and one would also notice that the PPE inside the PS3, very similar, 3.2 GHz, runs 2 threads on the PPE. Of course, it has the SPEs rather than any additional PPEs, so it's only got the one PPE with 2 hardware threads. The rest, of course, are all running on the SPEs. So one would wonder, well, what similarities? And as it turns out, Microsoft contacted them, and they actually use the PPE element, and the manufacturers actually built a version of that for the Xbox 360, and they, of course, added 3 of those together, and that's kind of what the architecture for the Xbox 360. So they're almost like cousins in that respect, the CPUs. It's just that the 360 version was a hell of a lot easier to utilize. But one of the reasons that I didn't continue to go the x86 route was pretty simple. And in my mind, it's actually quite easy to look at. Look at the power levels of the processors available then. I'll give you a hint, they were crap. x86 was really good on the desktop, but back in 2003, 2004, multi-core processors weren't really around at the stage we are now. There weren't really any low-power x86 devices. I think in addition to all of that, to further compound the problem, they also ran fairly hot. I remember a couple of friends owned laptops, and to get a reasonable price laptop, we're not talking super high end. I remember, you're a console manufacturer, you cannot put £1,000 worth of equipment into the sucker. I mean, you could, but you're going to be broke at the end of it. And their laptops, invariably at the bottom, they always used to run really hot, and this is because they were still shrinking the dies of the processor, and it just wasn't an ideal way to go. And a lot of the cores were still single core, dual core at most, and it just wasn't the architecture they needed to go with. On the desktop, they had ridiculously fast CPUs for the time, and now, of course, they're much faster. But in terms of the laptop form, they weren't really ideal. And so, of course, they could have just made it very similar to the original Xbox, but Microsoft got a lot of stick. They got hit with it quite a bit because of the size of the original Xbox, the cooling that it required. As it turns out, the Xbox 360, ironically enough, had its own heat problems anyway, but that was for a slightly different reason. It was mostly because of the fact that it can dissipate the heat rather than anything else from the Xenon cores. I also suspect that another reason that both manufacturers wanted it was because they didn't want to be beholden so much to one manufacturer. Now, it must have been very difficult for Sony to swallow that pill. It must have been like, how'd you like the taste of that one? Because they spent an awful lot of money. Well, not just them, but of course their partners as well, such as IBM. They spent a lot of money researching the cell processor, and it's a very powerful system. The problem is, it's just not cost effective to produce. I would also add that another reason they probably went with the design they did is because of the GPU compute. Now, we know that this is becoming synonymous actually with PlayStation 4 games development, and developers are already starting to tap into it a little bit. For example, we're starting to see the developers behind Resogun using it, Killzone's using it a little bit, though only for memory defragmentation at the moment, although we're not sure what their current state is. For all we know, but they're using it now for particle effects, for example. They certainly weren't in the beginning, and this is going to be something that's going to become fairly consistent. Obviously, the GPUs, ALUs, are very, very good at this, and they're basically taking a lot of the work that the cells SPEs would be doing, although they're much more efficient at it and a lot easier to program. Both developers are also wanting to pull development from indie games. Now, it's not just a benefit of indie games, because the thing is, if you make things easier for indies, then it automatically becomes easier for AAA developers. One of the developers just today, actually, on Call of Duty was saying that games development is becoming a lot more costly, AAA games development. And while someone could easily cite something like GTA 5 at the time I'm recording this, he says, not actually aware of the date, 22nd of that's the 22nd of September. I don't know how the hell the month's already gone so late. I was about to say August. Anyway, GTA's already made, like, what was it, $1 billion? Or something absolutely ludicrous. And the figures are probably behind, but, you know, within just a couple of days of opening, it made 800 million. Now it's already up to $1 billion. And someone could easily continue to cite that and say, well, AAA games are very live and healthy, but most games don't make that. Of course, you do get the Call of Duties and so on. And so, okay, you cough up 100 million, 200 million to produce the game, but that's equivalent of me giving you, think of it this way, I give you, you give me £10, just for example, I give you £50 back. In other words, it's a very, very good chunk of investment. It's, you know, very good ROI, return on investment. And I think we're going to be seeing situations where they do want, however, to reduce the cost of development, and this is one of those situations where going X86 definitely facilitates that. I also have a suspicion that from Microsoft's perspective, we know, for example, that they want to start making cross-platform development, and this is actually a quote from Steve Ballmer, the CEO. Of course, he will be resigning soon to let someone else lead the company. But they also want better APIs that are much easier to cross-platform develop, and applications which facilitate this as well. And it makes sense to actually have some parity between the desktops that, you know, you and I are going to be using. Even if you're using an Apple device, you're most likely now using X86 if it's a modern-day Mac. And of course, if you're building like a Windows-based PC, then you're inherently going to be. And I think this is like a case of the market is really starting to change now. I think that X86 was definitely the way forward because of the APU/SOC designs that are becoming available. The PlayStation 4, of course, does use Humor for this as well, and Xbox One does have some coherent memory to allow the computing to become a lot more fluid. And it just makes sense. I mean, I kind of guessed, to be honest, before it was released. I thought to myself, I don't know what processor they would be using because there were so many bloody different options. And obviously the development time of these consoles started about 2008. So, you know, they started to kind of do their research in 2007. At least Sony, I don't have a clue about Microsoft. There are some rumours that they started a little bit later, but I think both companies really started to want to push towards unifying development, making it easier for them, also cost as well. I mean, the AMD Jaguar is considerably cheaper. I mean, look at the cost of the PS3 versus PS4. A lot of the people, when, you know, PS3 that I knew when it came out, they were just like, I'm not paying this for a console. They wanted the damn thing in some cases, they did, and it had nothing to do with the specifications of the system. They just flat out refused to bloody well pay that price for a system when the Xbox 360 was already out, and I believe it just had a price reduction as well, as kind of like a slap from Microsoft to Sony, and, you know, that's just how business works, of course. And it just makes sense. I mean, you know, Sony, of course, couldn't really reduce the price this much. I mean, this is exactly what happened to other consoles as well, such as, say, the Neo Geo, as well as other consoles along the line as well, like the Sega Saturn is a classic example. It had a lot of memory, but the very, very complicated CPU and video processing elements inside the Saturn made it prohibitively expensive to start cutting prices, and Sony had to, Sega had to start to change the manufacturing process of the Saturn and start to reduce it. And that's why you can actually see some discrepancies between the Saturn. In fact, you can actually do some mods, I believe, for the Saturn that you can't actually do with some of the later model Saturns. In fact, I actually remember when I took my Sega Saturn in to get modded, back when I was fairly young, of course, very young, I took it into like a local computer store and they modded it for me, and they actually had to check it out on the phone. They said, you know, what model is it? Because there were some things that couldn't be done, and I wanted the region switch as well as the ability to play games at 60 Hz, which unfortunately back then 50 Hz was like the standard, and I'm sure many of you will be aware that that's not really ideal for frame rate on certain fighting games, regardless, kind of going off the beaten path. So this is just what I'm saying. There's been a hell of a lot of changes that have been done in the last couple of years. I think that we're going to be moving towards this space, and as it turns out, AMD, in a recent interview, you can check it out. I've got a couple of them on the channel. You can just type in AMD interview, and they actually were saying that they believe the very similar heterogeneous kind of idea is going to be for desktops as well. They actually have a very different idea to what Intel does. I actually have been an Intel fan for quite a while. To be honest, my last few systems have actually been Intel. I'm currently running Intel processor. Before that I was running Intel processor, and I think even the system before that was as well, and then I was running some AMDs, but I actually prefer AMD's vision for the desktops in the future. They believe in a more heterogeneous APU idea, and they also believe that, of course, APU is going to be there, but for those of us who wish to game on a PC, well, fine, you know, you can actually put in your own Radeon graphics card, and that will work in kind of like a tandem, almost like a crossfire. And I actually really like that idea for desktops as well. So you can see just how, well, you can just see how everything's starting to tie together now, and how people are starting to move forward. I mean, this is one of the big issues as well that we're discussing the other day about Moore's Law as well. That's quite a big one. If you're not really sure about what Moore's Law is, you can search on the channel. I have got videos of it. I still need to do a second part of that. But Moore's Law is basically that, of course, the amount of the amount of transistors on a CPU will increase at a set pace, and basically we're starting to see that law start to break down now because of various reasons. It's quite an interesting read, and that's one of the reasons as well that we're seeing GPU start to GPU start to push forward as well. Anyway, I think it's been a fairly interesting video actually. Hopefully you guys have found it informative. I'm going to get going, however, so I'm going to leave you guys to it, and I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.